We live, Nate?
Live.
All right. Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the TrustedSec, not podcast, but get together. Our whole purpose of this was to kind of get everybody together from different teams, talk about what we're seeing in different areas, go through, what we're seeing as far as industry trends and, areas that, we focus on here day in and day out. So can I officially call you my co-host now, Justin? Because it's like 2 in a row that you've been to. So I feel like you could be like
tag along
like co-host, sometimes the co-host. But we got Justin Elsie here, and we got also Paul Berkland. And Paul has been here for a number of years, and it's been incredible to see kind of your progression through TrustedSec and where you've come from. But why don't you give us a little bit of intro of yourself, man, and we'll go from there.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, my name is Paul Berkland. I've been at TrustedSec about 7 years now. So I come from like a lot of infrastructure background, like doing sysadmin stuff, working in Knox, that type of thing, running, programming. So I come from there, moved over to security, and have been making my way through there since about 2015 or so. So yeah, I've worked a number of positions here at TrustedSec. I started off on our general force team. From there, I went to the red team for a little while, and now I run our cloud pen testing.
Also has one epic beard that you've been growing for a while. We like to call Paul our Viking because he's like literally a Viking for the most part. I mean, you do like weird stuff in the middle of the wood, not like weird stuff, but like you like go out in the middle of the woods and like forage for food and stuff like that, and live off of the land and kill animals and start wars with other opposing tribes. Is that correct?
Yes, especially the last item there.
No, it's interesting to see Paul's progression because very similar to me on the health kick. I think it was where were we at when I first saw you for the first time after we were at a restaurant, and I was like, oh my god, like Paul. For those that don't know, Paul used to be like this tiny dude, like real small guy, and he's definitely not a tiny small guy anymore. He's a big dude. Last time I saw him, I was like, dude, what are you doing? Because like I was like, I'm interested, and we started talking about the weightlifting stuff and. Very inspirational, motivational, which helped me get to, where I'm at today too on the health side. We were at a conference or something. It was
I think it was at DEF CON, actually. I feel like it was one of the DEF CONs.
Yeah.
But you know what the neat thing is, like and your progression obviously has been amazing too. We're looking at it on Twitter. I just saw your picture the other day. Very nice.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That's the only reason I do this, by the way, is to get compliments from other men.
That is exactly how it goes.
That's all I care about. Like we're just not to derail you, but I was just on vacation in St. Thomas, and there was this like 55-year-old, like really muscular jack dude that walked past me, and I'm like, man, like I'm 40. I'm like, I hope I'm looking like that when I'm 55, right? So the guy walks past me, he looks at me, I look at him. We have like this special moment. And he says to me, he's like, looking good, dude. I'm like, dude, you too. Congratulations, man. I'm like, I hope I look like you. He's like, yeah, keep going, man. You're doing awesome. I'm like, and my wife looks at me like, what the hell's going on here? Like, but it's amazing to see, because you realize how much work goes into that. But sorry, I didn't mean to derail, but it was just a funny conversation.
No,
yeah,
no, and that's an amazing bromance there.
Yeah,
because you recognize the work that each of you has put in, right? Like. Yeah. And who knows better than somebody who's put in that work, like how much effort that really is. But the thing I wanted to mention was just that it's really actually kind of neat. There's a lot of overlap, I think, between weightlifting and hacking. Like
I agree.
The things that make you a good weightlifter are also things that make you a good hacker. It's that drive, that self competitiveness, and wanting to beat yourself, be better than yourself. And then it's also one of those things where it's like you're only accountable to you. So like nobody else cares if you can put up 315 or whatever. It's only you that really cares. And it's only you that you're competing against. So, I think it's very similar. And I think a lot of the same hacker mindset goes in there.
Well, it's been really... Oh, God, sorry, Justin, go ahead.
I was just saying, I'm out here trying to put up points on a CTF, but I can't. I got nothing.
But it's the same drive, though. I'm like, you want to be better at that CTF, right? I remember when I would go through a CTF and it'd be competitive, especially against other people. I'd be like, I have to win, or else, it's going to be one of those things where I feel like I didn't do enough or I wasn't good enough. And same thing when you're hacking, the amount of persistence that goes into that, you have to have that drive and motivation. Otherwise, you're just going to be someone that's running a Nesta scan and validating findings, and they're not going to get the value that, you're going to get from that craftiness of an attacker. Craftiness of an attacker, especially if you look at like an adversary, they're continuously trying to figure out ways to get into your infrastructure. They're continuously trying to find ways that you have a flaw, and it's not necessarily through a scanner. You have different groups that focus on different things, for different phishing campaigns, sophistication levels, and that drive is very similar to the fitness side, because you always want to continuously do the best you can for yourself, and continue to push yourself in a direction that allows you to be either healthier, bigger, stronger, faster, whatever your objectives are. It's the same thing. You always want to be a better hacker. You want to learn a new programming language. You want to learn the latest tool that came out because you want to be better at what you do. It's the same concept 100%.
And I see people fall kind of into the same obsession with hacking, like with you really, it's fun. You get that feedback loop where you see progress and now you're happy about it. And it's kind of the same thing with lifting, right? Like as soon as like the first person that ever notices that you lift, if you don't tell anybody and you start lifting and somebody notices it, that feeling is just amazing. Like you've transformed yourself, and it's physical and real, and it's demonstrable. Like you can show it, you can see it right in front of you. And that's actually the kind of the weird thing, is like it's kind of a flip side to hacking in that sense, in that like hacking, obviously there are different levels of awesome hacker, but with weights and stuff, there is one weight only, and you know what I mean. Like it's kind of like how lock picking, I think, is a good complement to hacking, because it's something that's grounded really in reality, that you can be like, yes, I am this good at this. Whereas with hacking, sometimes like there's a lot of that imposter syndrome, and like it's just such a wide field now. Like you can be amazing at one thing, but not be that great at another related aspect of it.
100%. It's like sumo versus conventional. It's like whatever you kind of focus on.
Yes.
I'm in the sumo camp. I'm a taller guy, so I prefer sumos over anything. But there's obviously the folks that are conventional, and there's folks that focus on web apps versus mobile apps versus networking systems. So very differences in there. It's cool, and it's cool. I mean, like you're always progressing. I'm always progressing. It's always great to see your progress and what you're doing. And you're the first one to introduce me to flipping tires and the log bars, which I really appreciated. It was the best way I can explain lifting with Paul is that you're like back a million years, and you're a caveman, and you're like using big things to pick up and put down, when there's no technology or anything else. You're just flipping big things and grunting, and that's what that is. So it's like the same time I lifted with one of my trainer, Ben's friend. His name is Helmy. And the guy's a beast. I mean, he's like, he's deadlifting 800 plus pounds or whatever. I mean, the guy's just a friggin' monster. And when I lifted with him, it was like a whole different experience of like this primal, like violent, like type of situation where this guy's just throwing massive weights around and stuff. So it's cool to lift with different people and get different experiences for sure. That's what this whole podcast is, by the way, is just to talk about lifting. But now listen, I wanted to get you on, just talk a little about, what you're doing, what you're seeing, what your team focuses on. I think it's important to note too, like, everybody's all hyped up on AI right now, and you can't leave a conversation without hearing ChatGPT. I was just in a meeting with a bunch of CEO peer groups, and of course that was the first topic that came up, and it's going to take over the world, all the way from Terminator to completely automate all of our jobs out of the world. Just like NFTs were going to be, the next big thing. We look at this and say, from a rationality perspective, how does that impact us? But if you look at today and you look at what the trends are today, I mean, everybody is in some sort of cloud infrastructure, used in some way, shape, or form, whether it's, through Azure, whether it's through AWS or GCP, whether it's through, their HR systems, whatever it ends up being. Cloud has really made things a lot easier for organizations to manage systems and infrastructure. But along with that comes a lot of complexity, right? They don't know the systems. I'll tell you, having experience in Azure, I would 100% rather have on-prem than I would to have to navigate Azure's UI and have to deal with everything there. Get down to the command line. I know you could do PowerShell, and everything directly within there, but having my own systems that I can operate on and work on versus having to go through a UI for most of the stuff just, isn't my cup of tea. But talk a little about your practice and what you're seeing from a cloud perspective, and what do most people, I think, struggle with in cloud? Is it visibility? Is it understanding complexity? Is it, what's the main areas that you see in your practice?
Sure. So, I mean, let's talk real quick about the real basic differences with cloud testing versus like on-prem network testing. So with your traditional network pen testing, you're looking at, I refer to it as network pen testing specifically because you're looking at it from a network perspective. You're seeing what services are available, what ports are open, what services are running on those ports. So I mean, it's very much focused on that. Whereas if you do that with the cloud environment, you're going to miss a lot of the attack surface there because of that interface that you mentioned, right? And there's different ways of interacting with it in AWS and Azure. The thing is though that traditional pen testing won't cover all of your bases if you're applying that to an organization that's in the cloud. You'll get some of it still, but things like storage accounts even you might miss if your pen tester isn't familiar with identifying storage or checking storage accounts externally, that type of stuff. There's just a lot of attack surface that is not going to be there based on that traditional perspective. So that's the big difference here between on-prem and cloud stuff that we're seeing. And obviously each cloud setup is going to be a bit different. Some places are completely serverless. On AWS, that's going to be the Lambda functions, etc. Some places are basically just migrating their on-prem into the cloud. So, I mean, two different organizations can have a vastly different set of services that they use. So for this reason, scoping is a little bit different too. In the past, it was really easy. Say, hey, how many IP addresses do you have externally, internally? And we can give you an estimate based on that because it's a good barometer for that. But if you do that in a cloud environment, you might be completely off the rails with your scoping. So let's say, if they're all serverless and they have one VM sitting out there somewhere, you think, oh, it's a small environment. The other aspect that's kind of difficult with scoping is not just the width of services, but then how they're broken up into different accounts or tenants, subscriptions, etc. So that can also add a layer of complexity there to how everything interacts, how they all work with each other. And then the final thing that makes things more complex is when you do hybrid environments, so you have on-prem and on the cloud, you're syncing to the cloud, or you just have a VPN up between your cloud environment and your on-prem. That can also add some interesting challenges to testing. So let's walk back here a little bit and talk a little bit about like things that we find that are impactful. Or Elsie, did you have anything to
No,
add?
I was just going to say, like, when we started going down this road, like, I know you and I and Martin and some others, like, we started looking at like what other people offer, and we were like, oh, like your cloud pen test is looking for like S3 buckets and like looking for just brute forcing, and then there really was not a plan laid out, and it's kind of been something that we've had to like drive towards and build out because there just wasn't a blueprint for this that most people were following, and then we kind of ended up in this hybrid position where we want to test what's out there on the internet, but you're also into give me a security reader level account. Like, I need to deep dive and go in here. And I think that originally most people looked at the cloud testing side as kind of the lift and shift. Hey, I took all these VMs, I moved them onto ESXi, I moved them over to EC2 instances, and like that is such a small part of what cloud stuff is. But I think that since it's new, you don't have a lot of people in traditional enterprises that fully understood this stuff, right? Like West Coast companies, they've been doing this for a long time, but we've had a big problem trying to find people who are talented in this because normally you have to build it before you break it. And since it's been emerging, it's been a tough spot for us.
Yeah, definitely. I can understand that. Now, with cloud testing, the AWS and the Azure sides can differ a bit too, just between those two different types of organizations. Because on the AWS side, it's normally going to be just like developers that are in there. Sometimes you have a few more users, but a lot of the times it's going to be like hosting an application or Kubernetes in there, and you just have not as many people hands-on in that environment. Whereas Azure, because of its identity management, you end up with a lot of users there, and that's a lot more possible ways to jump into that environment. So I would say from a pen testing perspective too, if you're a pen tester, some of these gigs are definitely more fun than others. Like if they're just if it's a fresh setup in AWS and they're following all the best practices and VPCs are really locked down and everything is really very thoughtfully set up, that can be a boring pen test. It's because they followed all the right things, they're doing all the right things, and that's great. They're using secrets managers instead of like storing passwords in code, all that type of stuff. I mean, the pen testing experience really varies depending on how big of an environment it is, how many people are using it. It's on the Azure side of things. I want to go back there just because so many companies use Azure. It's the adoption rate is insane. It's like something like 95% of Fortune 500s are on Azure. And from my own testing, it's that holds up. It might even be higher that are officially on Azure, because most companies, even if they don't use Azure directly, they at least have a tenant reserve there. But actual use of Azure, 95% seems about accurate, and that's I think what Microsoft publishes for about the Fortune 500 companies, and that's a huge, huge I mean, attack surface there if you're looking at it like from the perspective of a whole. So with Azure, things that we often find that are problematic areas are it's still password spraying, right? There's still bad passwords, because there's a number of ways that this can happen. I mean, the Azure does build in some stuff now to help prevent bad passwords, but when you sync up from on-prem, I've even found password lowercase before on an Azure account. So it's a work in progress. It's one of those things. Besides
from a password spraying perspective, I mean, still having success being able to brute force user accounts through authentication and all that good stuff. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, we've been hearing for like the last how many years that like MFA is gonna be the silver bullet, or conditional access plus MFA and all that. And I mean, large organizations, it's just hard. There's a lot of users, and it's easy to miss something, I would say.
Well, and isn't it true that so in order to do straight multi-factor authentication, you have to have a certain tier within Azure? It's like their E5 licensing, I think, to do true MFA, not the what they consider their like suspicious logins or whatever it ends up being.
It is definitely tied to, I mean, you get what you pay for, right? And
Right.
I don't know if I agree with that as a security model for this. I mean,
Yeah.
it
That's always
it
been my biggest
seems
complaint
like
is like you have all these small businesses that, literally should come default with MFA, but they, basically implemented suspicious logins. So if you're logging from a different location or things like that, or whatever they classify, but I found that it doesn't always hit or trigger. It isn't always great as far as being able to detect that. So, kind of crummy that they don't put that in place, and allow you to have MFA. But then even when you do, so if you do get that tier licensing and then you do MFA, you still have to manually add multi-factor authentication onto that account in order to do it, unless you do it through some sort of automation. So it's just kind of weird how they have the security baked into it. It makes it a little bit harder and challenging. And you actually have to disable their I think what they call their security, high security model or something, module or something like that, and then you basically have to degrade your security to get multi-factor authentication put in place and then put the things back on, which is just really kludgy when I was using it.
So the thing that frustrates me about it is that these extra security features. The reason why a lot of companies go to Azure, small and medium businesses, right, is because they can't really afford full-time IT staff, or it's kind of like an easier way. A lot of these smaller places use cloud because they don't want to, set up their own servers or infrastructure. Maybe they can't. And the cloud's a good, accessible way to do that. And so now you have all these places that are already kind of like in a deficiency with security. They're going to the cloud to, try to make things easier and standardize for them. But then you have some of these insecure defaults, and you're making things harder, and you're not allowing them to do proper monitoring. So you have things, I think a lot of the educational sector, actually, that higher ed, they might actually have the money for it, but not the higher ed, they use Azure a lot. There's a lot of local and state governments that use Azure. So I mean, there's a lot of places, the local and state governments, I think, is where you find that they might not have the funding that they need to do some of this stuff. Education, it might vary depending on how much money they're bringing in there. But it's these smaller organizations, I think, that are really impacted by these defaults in security in Azure that are not so good. So yeah, that's something I would really like to see change in the future, is like if they could, implement some of these more secure options and then let you go less secure if you want to, but make the default, especially things like Skype or not Skype, but Teams now and external access, letting anybody by default, any Skype user even can message a Teams user at an organization. If you go into the Microsoft write-up, it's external access is the name of the feature, and it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, how many businesses need this as a business model, like that they need to be able to interact with external organizations over IM, first of all, that they'd want to set this to the default. But yeah, then the fact that it opens up this whole extra layer, like now with external access on, you set up your Teams for the first time. Anybody can see if you're online, if they have your email address. It's also easy to enumerate you. So like you're really like, it's like the panopticon. Anybody can see you at any time logged into Azure, as long as external access is enabled. So that's kind of like it's a privacy thing too, right? Like I don't need people to know if I'm away or available or not unless I'm talking to them directly. Like,
Well, shifting your entire, AD presence, group policy, and everything else directly into cloud, centric facing infrastructure, seemed like a great idea at the beginning, right? But I think the ease of use for businesses, right? Not having to maintain that on-prem infrastructure. Everybody wants to talk about getting rid of, their data centers and not having to maintain and maintain those types of facilities. So there's obviously a lot of pluses from a business perspective, but it's interesting. I was just talking to a bunch of CISOs recently at an event I was at, and they were talking about how cost-wise, it doesn't end up saving them any money whatsoever down in the long run. It ends up being pretty much a wash or even more expensive as you start to go into these models. So you're really not getting a lot of cost savings there, but they have a lot of the complexities that are introduced because if you don't have a good program around managing cloud, whether that's new systems that you're spinning up, approval processes for that, ownership, those types of things, it gets really messy very quickly in your environment because you don't know what you have. It goes back to asset inventory management, and things are all over the place, shadow IT. And a lot of companies really struggle with getting those processes put into place first to be able to really brunt that side. And you have a good opportunity, by the way, if you're moving directly to Azure and you get those all ahead of time, you have a good chance of being able to manage it in a consistent way. But most companies don't. They just go straight for there, and then it's kind of like a YOLO, do what you want to.
You definitely want to come into it with a plan. Sorry, what?
Yeah, I think something that's not talked about too much is that the cloud providers are learning as they go too with a lot of the problems that they're encountering. So like S3 buckets used to be public by default, and now they've been like, oh, a bunch of people got hacked, but we should change that. Or you see MFA with Azure, you can always get people to accept a push. Now they're switching the default behavior. So it's like they're coming along and learning as we go. But I don't think anybody really took the time to go, oh, we're building all this cloud stuff. Let's threat model how this is going to get abused. One of the things we always like to lean on the red team is, similar infrastructure to the client and using that for relaying traffic, hosting payloads, doing things like that. And you really, as like a top tier provider, you need to go through and go, hey, this is a great new offering. How is this going to get abused, and how can we manage the abuse of this platform? Microsoft's changing their top level domain for cloud stuff real soon. Because a lot of people could just register like a Azure Websites domain, and you could say, oh, I trust the top level, but there's some malicious content here. Like there's a whole process needs to happen going back through all these cloud providers and saying, hey, how can somebody abuse this? How can we detect it? And how can we respond quickly? And I think that's really on, Amazon and Microsoft, because they're so prevalent and they really kind of set the stage for this. And that's something that is just going to need to happen, or it's going to keep getting, abused by everybody.
What do you see, Paul, as far as when your team's going in and doing these types of engagements? Like, what are some of the main areas that companies should really focus on as far as locking their infrastructure down? Some of the, obviously passwords being one of those from a credential stuffing perspective, or easily guessed passwords. But what do you typically see as being some of the main areas that companies really lack in cloud infrastructure and security that they can take away from this?
So and also I real quick sidebar here is, I know I've been talking some trash about Microsoft here. I do actually think that the Azure cloud is, generally speaking, a really good thing. You have standardization, and when things come along that Microsoft identifies, they can fix it all at once via the platform there. I mean, in many cases. So anyways, but Dave, the question that you had there was, what are the things that we're seeing that could be most impactful to organizations? I mean, like
to fix issues, like where do you have the most amount of success as an attacker in cloud infrastructure?
So something that I think that people need to be aware of when they're moving to the cloud is the idea of storing secrets securely. That's something that I think is a big problem across the board in both environments. But by both, I mean AWS and Azure primarily. So in Azure, it takes the form of, you got improperly stored secrets in SharePoint. That's classic, right? But you also have things like in logic apps, people sometimes might put credentials in there. They might put in runbooks, they might have credentials stored. They're not utilizing some of the new features of cloud where you can properly store secrets and manage them, like where you can retrieve them and not have them be stored in an insecure fashion. I think coming from on-prem to cloud, it's natural. You're just going, I'm going to copy my scripts up here. Same thing, right? We use the same type of model, but they might not be aware of some of these extra cloud features that can make them more secure. So there's secrets stored in scripts, secrets stored, file shares like classic SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. That I think is the biggest area for improvement, generally speaking. And then AWS, it's the same type of thing where like people will improperly store secrets and not take advantage of the built-in processes for that. So,
and what do you see from a when you're looking at going after and targeting an organization, is it still user population being kind of your initial entry? And what does getting so I know when I would pen test and do attacks against organizations, once you got that user account, whether it was through phishing, you got code execution, and now you have the ability to query the domain and start to understand groups and policies and everything else through attached domain infrastructure. Is that still predominantly the largest area that you focus on when you're going after them for initial access, and then from there, kind of moving forward post exploitation?
So yeah, definitely, especially on the Azure side, right? On AWS side, there's not as much of the brute forcing aspect, but on the Azure side, especially, there is that initial access point of trying to get a user there. We put a lot of effort on that. Phishing obviously would also be a good way to do it, but that lands usually more on the red team side. But yeah, getting that initial access as a user. Then the other part that's kind of problematic, that's getting harder now, and it's actually an improvement on Microsoft's part, is that the multi-factor is becoming more prevalent. You have non-push formats, but push, getting a weak password, push format, spamming, still an easy way in a lot of the times. And then once you get in, yep, exactly. And then once you get in,
by the way, it seems to work all the time, especially if you can get the location to be in a general location of where they're at. Just high success probability there. But it still amazes me that push notification is even considered still a standard way of multi-factor authentication. We need to burn that to the ground in any way, shape, or form. But yeah.
And the only difference I would say is that sometimes it's trickier to get to an internal perspective from that initial access than it used to be, like with on-prem. So if you got access to the VPN and they had a VPN set up, you jump into the local network, right? Now you can start running your classic playbook and jump on Sysvol or whatnot, grab some password from in there and run with it, or Kerberos, etc. With the cloud, there's not always that nice network perspective that you can get to, and this all goes back to like adoption of the cloud, how many people have what roles. So if you're not using like any roles in Azure and everybody's not even like I guess if there's no owners or roles that you get access to, it makes it a lot harder, because what can you do then? You don't have access to for instance, get to the cloud console or whatnot. There's different areas that you really actually need provisioned access to reach. And if the organization is not heavy in the cloud yet, you're not going to find all those fun access points to jump in through. So it can be a little bit trickier modern day, I think, actually, to pivot into like a network perspective foothold. But definitely hanging out in there, there's a lot of ways to maintain persistence in an account once you get a single cred there, depending on what the default settings are, if they've left them or if they've changed them. But there are various ways that you can maintain your foothold there. It's just sometimes a little trickier to find that priv-esque path to get to be more than that standard user. But I think as cloud comes along, that'll change. As more people use it and it gets messier. I think that's something else he's been saying for a while now.
I always look at it as like, okay, I can't pivot to the network, but can I still impact the business, right? So if we offloaded all of our files to OneDrive and I hacked somebody in HR who can read all of the mergers and acquisitions data files, then the impact is still there. So I know that as pen testers, we're always like, oh, we need to get, domain admin, global admin, whatever. But there's still so many areas where, like you said it before, hey, we moved to SharePoint in the cloud and our development team sticks all of their secrets or whatever other data there. And then I can pivot to AWS or some servers. Like all those paths are still going to exist, and they will keep existing because humans make those mistakes. So trying to like squash those ahead of time. And I think a lot of people jumped into the cloud faster than they should have. This was a really great chance to say, I get to do over all of the mistakes I inherited from on-prem AD. Like on-prem AD has been around so long, like you just have so much debt out there. This is a good opportunity to say, like, we're going to run Azure, we're going to deploy CIS benchmark, we're going to do all the best practice. And people are like, like we kind of got over here with email, and then somebody spun up some servers. Then like 2 weeks later, like half of our company's in there. And like this is, if you pause and you think about it as like a CISO or CTO or whoever, like you can really get ahead of this and get a long way. And I think that people didn't make that pause. They're like, oh, it'll be a slow shift, and then all of a sudden it's whammy all of our infrastructures over here.
Yeah,
Do you think since you've been testing, companies are getting more aware of how to lock down their infrastructure? Has it been getting better, or is it kind of consistently just depends on the company or organization? What's your opinion as far as like maturity levels in the cloud? Are we getting better at what we're doing there? And also follow up with a question too. When cloud really first came out, there really wasn't a lot of focus on this from like an attack surface perspective, what adversaries were doing. Even the industry really didn't focus much on cloud centric because we still had on-prem. It was still a much easier access point. How's the security industry been focusing on cloud? I mean, you see nation states that were focusing very heavily, most specifically Russia, on Azure specifically, token impersonation, API key theft, those types of things. Where do we see this heading, and are we getting any better at it?
So I think that, okay, first of all, for places that we've retested, 100%, we've seen improvement in the places that we've come back and retested a year later. So a little self promotion there, but
so use TrustedSec for your cloud security services.
The I guess, sorry, stepping back here a little bit. A lot of times what we see was one of two things. It's going to be either they're doing what LZ mentioned there, and they're starting fresh without any of that technical debt and any of the existing issues there from before. They're starting over fresh and creating everything nice, or it's where they just dumped it, push it up into the cloud, and in those cases, that's where we find the room for improvement oftentimes. So I think that it really depends on how you migrated to the cloud, first of all, but we definitely are identifying areas for improvement that can make things harder for an attacker. It's just a matter of where you're starting from, really. The interesting thing about some of the AWS stuff with starting there is that we see domain controllers in the cloud in AWS hosted, and so that now opens up some interesting attack paths. We've had in those cases, you can actually run your old pen testing playbook, right? Like, and just go through there and compromise from there. And then that opens up some new attack paths, depending on if they have single sign-on configured with that. I know it's a little bit off topic there, but generally speaking, I think things are a lot better in the cloud than what we see on-prem oftentimes. On-prem, there's a lot of those older networks that have been sitting around for a while that have been upgraded over time, and they've fixed things over time, but it's not a comprehensive, top or bottom up building from scratch again. It's that I think the cloud environments in general are much more secure. There's a lot more emphasis that they place on, segmentation of networks, of limiting role assignments, and especially we've seen some places that do really good with the just-in-time, role assignment, the PIM, so that they can just have the access that they need as they need it and not be assigned it full time. That's a big thing that we've seen that's been very helpful for organizations if they have the licensing to deploy it.
What feature? Oh, go ahead, Jessica. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna throw this out that I go through phases of feeling this way, that things have been improving in the cloud, and then we have a pretty diverse set of clients that we red team with, traditional enterprise, AD. We have other ones that are everything is in the cloud, and I would have expected that some of those ones where we wouldn't get as far as we did, but it's been a big ask to get into DevOps pipelines and push code and do all these things. And like we've been very successful over on that side. And sometimes I was, going in it like this is going to be a pain, and it's all new, and as this is gonna be very hard to do. But like a lot of times with like single sign-on and just the oversharing goes back to the secrets manager thing. It's like you could single sign on as a customer service rep, somehow get to like their GitHub via single SSO and pull out some key. You jump to some low-level server, a little bit of moving around. So the things are still out there. I think as time goes by and you see companies get more mature and make more mistakes in the cloud, I think Azure will be a more interesting place because of how long it took a long time for like us to figure out curb roasting, for example. Like AD was around for how long that existed. There's still, I think, a lot of things are going to shake out of design issues and flaws like that. Yeah, in the cloud you can kind of fix them a little quicker, but I'm fairly sure there'll be some locked in design mistakes that carry over. And I think the way people treated SSO is kind of one of those things where things get over provisioned, and you can take a low level user, fish them, and jump into all kinds of things they shouldn't. I think we'll start to see the impact on the cloud side be bigger than what it looks like to now because things are sort of balanced.
So I think that actually hits on a really good point that I want to make here is that if you test solely in the cloud, right? If we take away everything, let's say, okay, let's just think about this for a minute here. If we do a cloud test and it's only external, we have basically an external pen test, right? There might be some cloud aspects to it. If we do a cloud particular pen test where we just want to focus on the cloud configuration itself, we're only looking at the cloud environment, so the AWS or Azure environment. We're looking at that. We might look at some of the interaction, but where I think you really get your best benefit and you get the most real world ones is either on a red team or just doing a hybrid test, or what I call a hybrid test. It's where you do an internal pen test and then do your cloud assessment. That way you can take a portion, like let's say you find that HR person that has access to shares, because like separating an internal quote unquote from a cloud pen test, if the cloud is VPN to the internal, is that like we're trying to put things in boxes really at this point. And so like the best thing I think is to do a hybrid approach where you start off with a realistic entry point. You have all these users in AD, start off with an internal, do your internal testing, see what you find there. From there, are you able to pivot into the cloud? And I mean, if you get a domain compromise, that might be a little bit easier than if you don't, but also just identifying those attack paths in. And then the other side of that is the interesting part is that we've been able to identify some good detection gaps by looking at going from that cloud access point to the internal. Are you monitoring things where you're able to see like, so like Azure VMs, if we take over one of those and we're attacking from Azure to your on-prem over VPN, are you able to see that? Are you monitoring for that? So, I mean, there's a lot of, it's that in-between area, I think that it makes for really interesting testing, like not strictly cloud or not strictly internal, but where those things meld together. So I think that going forward, a lot of companies could benefit from scheduling both,
Where
external stuff will often be covered in kind of like a cloud assessment, but going with that internal plus a cloud assessment, I think is beneficial.
What as far as your ability to be detected and actually identified during these assessments, what would you say your probability of being detected as you're doing attacks against cloud infrastructure is today?
How much money are they paying Microsoft?
Yeah. Pretty slim.
I mean, so it depends. I think that they're getting better at it. Like graph stuff, there's new accessibility where you can see into the graph requests that are being made. That's relatively new. I would still like a way to see how like things like unsuccessful usernames being attempted, just so you can detect password sprays more readily than maybe they're not hitting a bunch of your accounts, maybe they're still trying to enumerate accounts, but that type of stuff. I think Microsoft is in a really good position to identify some things like that, like tons of DNS lookups to certain SharePoint subdomains, things like that. Like there's a lot of areas that they could probably get better intel from their vantage point and then share that actionably with customers so they can be aware of things. I don't know that. Yeah, there's definitely room for improvement.
Yeah, I mean, from what I see from most companies talking to them, at least, like they have minimum, if not any, visibility into their cloud infrastructure, what they're doing, and they really don't have a good plan for it. They assume that at least hopefully Microsoft or AWS or GCP, they're doing the diligence around protecting them, which they're really not from an attack surface perspective. Obviously, from a back end platform perspective, they are, but when it comes to direct attacks against infrastructure, especially within cloud, I mean, I typically see there's little to no visibility for detecting attacks and responding to, unless they have a massive security team and they happen to have like a bunch of amazing Azure ninjas, which are hard to find, and then are doing some really creative things.
They do have some good detections around like the failed logins now. That's becoming a pain in our butt. Is where you have to like come from a trusted area, like or if they see that you tried spraying through AWS, for instance, and you get a valid cred there. But now that cred gets marked as a compromised cred because it saw login from AWS all of a sudden, where the user had been previously logged in from Los Angeles, or what I mean? Like they can see the IP disparity and the geo disparity, and say, okay, that's probably not a real login. They mark it, and now you can't log in with that account anymore. So they are doing things that make it harder, but there's ways around it. You can VPN or spray through Azure itself, so you're originating from Azure IP space, that type of stuff. I mean, there's ways around it. But yeah, they are getting better, I think.
They finally fixed the IPv6 geolocation bug as well.
Right.
So
yeah.
they can geolocate on IPv6. So that's been my go-to for attacking cloud things is if there's alerting for something in the cloud, like password spraying or whatever, try it from IPv6 and find out how quickly they don't detect something because you have access to such a large number of IPs you can rotate through, even if they're sequential in the same net block. It breaks so many different SaaS and cloud providers detection methods for whatever reason.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I remember that. So yeah, it was that IPv6 in their rules wasn't categorized to anything. So and there's similar things with Microsoft settings like that. So with conditional access rules, they at one point introduced so they had Windows and Mac as options, and I think like Android, probably an iPhone, but at a certain point they introduced like Linux as an option there, but by default it wasn't checked. So then if you change your device to Linux, now you could bypass that conditional access because it only applied to user agents for AWS or web browsers or Mac and Windows, I should say. So yeah, there's different things like that where, and that goes back to kind of with the LZ saying that they're not always threat modeling or thinking through maybe all of their design choices here when they do things. It's Azure has a lot of responsibility because of it's all the eggs in one basket, so to speak, of all these Fortune 500, 1,000 companies, all these government institutions and educational institutions, local and state and federal, all that. So I mean, Azure has a big responsibility to make sure that the defaults are pretty secure and that they keep improving things, just because so much of the US economy is wrapped up in it. It's a big deal.
So we'll wrap things up here in just a minute, but just the last quick one on this, as far as general features that people can enable, and you mentioned securing credentials within there, but as far as like things that have helped customers big time, as far as features that either AWS, Azure, or GCP have that make a big difference in locking their infrastructure down, what would you say those are that people should focus on, at least configuration wise in cloud?
Sure. So I'm going to go back to Azure just because there's more defaults to fix there. And on AWS, it's mostly just like or like locking up your VPCs so that they only have access from what resources you need. But on the Azure side, there's a lot of defaults that you can change that are insecure. So the first one, external access. That's for Teams. It lets anybody talk to your or people in your organization. You probably don't need it for any of your workflows, most likely. And if you do, you can allow list certain domains. So you can only, odds are for most people's organizations, they won't need to be able to speak over Teams as a primary initial contact point. So anyways, that's a good easy win. Second one, turn off application registrations where you can create your own registrations or your own applications. It's an easy way to maintain some persistence there. If you're able to register an app with a compromised user, you can assign credentials to that. You might not be able to give it a whole lot, but at least you still have kind of an AD foothold there. You can keep user lists, and depending on what access has, you might be able to do some other stuff with that. So we have the application registration turned off. We have external access turned off. The third thing we're going to do is disable the ability to accept external applications. So this is something we don't see a whole lot from our side, but phishing with applications is definitely a thing where you can send somebody to a link and they say, oh, are you going to accept these permissions on this page with your Azure account? Say yes. And then they have access to read your email or whatnot. So that is locked down a bit. The thing is, once an attacker gets into your organization, if they're able to register an app, they could set up their own phishing app. And then the nice thing is that because it was set up from within your organization, it's considered a single tenant app and not a multi-tenant app, which is in Azure land dangerous. The single tenant app, there's not as many restrictions on what users can accept or consent to. So that's a classic way they'll get in through phishing or credential compromise, and then they'll set up an application, do some more phishing of users, and that's a way that you can then pivot there. So those are the three biggest things I would say off the top of my head is just turn off those three defaults in Azure, and you'll be a lot better off. And it's an easy win, and it won't be really impactful for most things that you're doing. And yet the other part is secrets managing, storing things properly, checking your SharePoint. Also, SharePoint's also a great place for payloads. If you get your initial access and you can throw something up on SharePoint, people trust a lot of things from SharePoint. So if you spoof an email to them, Microsoft Direct Send, that's another thing to be aware of. You can phish through SMTP servers of Microsoft to internal users, and there's no fix for it because it's a feature. The only thing you can do is make sure your mail gateway. Yeah, exactly. But it's just like in the 90s and whatnot. There's actually, I think, a Black Hills article about like phishing like it's 1999 through Microsoft SMTP. So they have yeah, it's open. You can send phishes. I love phishing through this. It does do some checks, right? So if you're trying to send a bunch of like zip files containing malicious executables through, it'll eventually pick up on that. But I had good success with getting those delivered to inboxes. HTML will get thrown to junk mail, but a zip file will not. I don't know. That's
Nice.
interesting. Yeah, and then especially password protected zip file, just if you want to be extra careful. But yeah, no. So yeah, you can send through that open relay as long as you have a fresh IP address. You will get your IP banned after a while, but you can at least get a good 20 messages through probably before they catch on to anything. So, anyways, yeah, that's
That
awesome.
that SMTP thing is super common when people use a third-party spam filter and don't follow instructions about putting the IP block list in as well. So if you use like Proofpoint, they're supposed to allow a certain set of IPs that are proof points, and you're using O365. People make that mistake, and you can
can at
direct
least get a
send
good 20
to as well, and
messages
just kind of
through.
bypass Proofpoint or whatever cloud email filter you might have.
Anyways, yeah, yeah, it's super common too. So
That's awesome. Well, any last parting words of wisdom or anything that we missed, LZ or Paul?
I was just going to say conditional access policies are, when properly configured, are kind of like a really good stopgap for protecting yourself and a good first barrier to kind of build out.
yeah, 100%, and just make sure you validate them, right? Like that you're trying out. There's some good tools for validating some of that. But yeah, I would just make sure that it's working as intended.
When we actually had one last question on the chat. One was how fast are you able to password spray against Azure before becoming flagged?
That's a good one. Okay, so it depends. It depends. And I'm not 100%. This is something I've been poking at for a while here, and I don't have a great answer for you yet. Okay, so things that you can, let's instead talk about some things that you can do to avoid lockouts for a little while. So obviously rotating your IP address using things like Fireprox is great for avoiding it for a little bit. It seems like if you do not order it by alphanumeric ordering, if you do a shuff on that list, it seems like it helps more. I think the main thing though is varying where you're coming from. It is a very annoying thing. I also though have seen where you'll start getting smart lockouts, right? With Graph, I'm assuming is what we're talking about, is hitting Graph. And you start hitting smart lockouts, but when you get a valid account, it still comes through. So you should go look at the smart lockout right up on Microsoft. There's some very particular things. It also, if I remember right, it's relying on the data center location. So in theory, I think there's a way that you could hit it from multiple places in such a way that you could avoid smart lockout mostly. But it's something that I don't have a great solution to yet. It's you play around with it, you try to deduce what's Microsoft doing here. Is this is it because I made 100,000 requests, or is it because of something else here? So it's definitely a tough thing, and I actually think they probably keep changing it and modifying it slightly to make it more effective. But
it's kind of the same cat and mouse game that I had with Windows Defender and Unicorn. You'd be like, where in my code are they flagging, and what are they piecing together in order to hit these two areas? And then as time progressed, it got a little more complex and a little more harder to circumvent. So it's a good I think that's a good thing. Obviously, continuously improving and trying to get better at what you're doing. But interesting enough, I actually just did I had to do a demo for someone, and I did a Defender bypass, and I was curious. It's been a while since I tested it, and I was wondering how long it would take for me to get around it. It was like, I don't know, 8 minutes or something like that to write something different. So still hasn't gotten much better there, but well, hey, thanks everybody. And Justin and Paul, appreciate coming on and hopping onto this. We try to do these once a month, just get a little bit familiar with the different practices we have here, what we're seeing, share some info. Also, if you look on I think it'd be the left side for everybody, maybe the right side, I'm not sure how the flipping works, but Black Hat, we'll be out at Black Hat August 5th through the 8th doing our actionable purple team class. Ben will be leading that. Ben 10 will be leading that class, as well as a number of other folks from our teams. We have a combination of both our blue team folks, our purple team folks, as well as our red teamers that go out there and do a really good course around showing the latest attacks and actually getting to do them. So you actually, do a simulated environment that we have. You get to do the attacks. You get to figure out how those are working. So we're teaching you obviously the latest red teaming type of techniques out there, and then the opposite side of being able to see what artifacts or ways that you can identify them in your infrastructure. And it's a really great class for both red team and blue teams to really understand kind of the attack patterns that are out there and what we're doing to really get better with detections. I always find it interesting. I learn something new every time I go there. And we'll definitely be out in Vegas full force and helping folks out learn with that with Black Hat. So hopefully get to see folks out there. You can register now at Black Hat's site, the actionable purple teaming class, and hopefully get to see a lot of folks out at Black Hat. We'll actually be having a Black Hat party with TrustedSec as well in Mandalay Bay. So another good year for us out there as well. But any last parting words, Justin, Paul, before we stop the stream?
Hack the planet.
Hack the planet. Hack the planet. Or is this in? Yeah, this in. I think, yeah. Tattoo. All right, everybody.